Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you as well, City Councillors and fellow Torontonians, for the privilege today to talk about what I think is a very important subject, which is really the role of openness in governing our city and enabling a much more efficient, a much more powerful, a much more relevant city government for all of us. In that very long and extended introduction, one point in particular I'd like to reiterate is I own and operate a think tank called MetaViews, and one of our main current projects is on the future of authority. And we're looking at the future of authority in part because of the way in which our society is perpetually changing. That in fact, one of the arguments we make that the main challenges to all of us as we try to cope is speed, and the pressures of speed, especially as that speed plays upon large bureaucracies and the public sector as a whole. Explicitly, what we found in our preliminary research is the tie between openness and legitimate authority. The type of authority that's recognized, that's followed, that's able to survive the turbulent times that we live in. And explicitly, it looks at the tsunami of information, how we all are pretty much overloaded, whether it's via emails, whether it's via the items that we all have to deal with. And so if I were to give a title to my remarks today, it would be that many hands make a lighter load. That the primary argument for open government, the primary argument for openness in our society is so that we can get some help from our friends. Explicitly, the municipal government will always face pressures of having to do more than it possibly can, and open government is the way that you can actually solve that you can actually accomplish those many things. Now, before I elaborate a little more on the role of open government, I want to just very briefly talk about the broader social context, which is that whether we like it or not, technology will not wait for us. Whether we like it or not, the internet will not wait for us. Rather than think of the internet as a computer network, rather than think of the internet as a series of machines, I refer to it as a learning curve. That the internet presents all of us with the opportunity to increase our literacy, increase our capacity, and this is very much true of public service and the public sector. That there is a great need to get on that learning curve and be able to understand how technology affects us. Because to quote Marshall McLuhan, the great Toronto patron saint of technology, nothing is inevitable provided you are willing to understand it. And here in Toronto, we've had a very vibrant tech sector, a very vibrant a social sector that has demonstrated that open government will happen regardless of the municipal government's participation. Regardless of the staff, of the city council's participation. It is in your interest to embrace open government, but open government will come regardless of your participation. I am here today to argue that it is in the greater interest of Torontonians, the greater interest of the greater good, that you lead this initiative, that you provide the legitimate authority to allow for all citizens to benefit. But I'd like to give two examples of how this will happen regardless of what we do. The first is the website illegalsigns.ca, which I hope you're all quite familiar with, which was essentially one individual taking on the Municipal Licensing Standards Office and being very successful over time in creating a new type of accountability and transparency that I'm going to assume created quite a bit of stress as well as quite a bit of cost for not just the MLS but the city government as a whole. And it's unnecessary in that this transparency can essentially be started, triggered by the government rather than citizens elsewhere. The second example, of course, is the G20. That the G20, while it may appear that there were protesters, it may appear that there were bystanders, in fact, as someone who is professionally covering it, there were more social media journalists on the streets of Toronto during the G20 than any other constituency. And this explosion of data is what is allowing people to bypass the SIU, to bypass the Police Services Board, to bypass official process, and create their own type of essentially vigilante justice, which is really the consequence of the future of authority. That if authority is not legitimately present and active, it will be superseded by citizens. And this is not always good, because generally speaking, there's a need to have proper public authorities, proper public government, making sure that everyone is protected. Because the danger of an illegitimate authority, the danger of government not being relevant, is this notion of mob justice, which happens every single day in Toronto, around the world, usually around stolen goods and stolen items. For example, in the last couple of weeks, if you put into Google stolen Mac, stolen iPhone, You'll see a number of examples of people who have had their property stolen and then use the surveillance capability of this property to find the victim, create a lynch mob, go after the person who actually stole the item without involving police, without involving traditional authorities. And while this mob justice is far faster, far more responsive than traditional forms, it obviously does not serve the greater good because there is no due process of law, there is no notion of innocent until proven guilty. And this is why there's an imperative for politicians, for city staff, for government as a whole to embrace the learning curve and understand how social media, how technology are empowering people, because data is power. And note, when I say data, I don't mean information. Information is arguably meaningless, whereas data refers to volume. Data is when you have so much information that the human cannot comprehend it, and instead machines are able to understand that data. Now, this data could originate with the city government, but it doesn't have to. It's in our interest to make this data available. It's in our interest to reinforce the authority of the city government to make this data available. But citizens now have technology in their pockets that allows them to collect this information regardless of traditional means, without the quality assurance, without the empiricism, without the type of essentially scientific process that we rely upon for accurate statistics. One example, there's this new mobile application called GigWalk, Gigwalk, that allows for the creation of virtual mobile workforces so that someone could, for example, pay people pennies to collect information wherever they are. There are lots of companies, lots of agencies, lots of special interests who will collect this data. And because that data will be proprietary, only they will have access to it and will allow them to put forward opinions, persuasions, intelligence that we won't have access to. As it stands, I would be foolish to suggest that processes here at City Hall are egalitarian. Obviously, if you're a developer and you can afford a lawyer, you will have a much easier time than a homeowner representing themselves. Well, that digital divide will become even extremely more pronounced when the data that is available to make arguments is far more valuable in the private sector than it is in the public sector. And you as city councillors and as city staff will not have access to that data. The onus, therefore, is to try to create a public infrastructure, a public culture, in which you see essentially citizens as allies of staff, allies of politicians who can help you continue to govern. Because the broader issue here is relevance. It would be unwise, it would be disingenuous of me to appear here before the municipal government without honestly telling you that the internet is a culture of lawlessness, that the internet itself is almost inherently anti-authoritarian, which is not a good thing for our broader public, but it encourages people to see the law as optional. It encourages people to see the public as optional. I know I witness this every day in terms of the near disobeying of the Highway Traffic Act that exists by pretty much everyone on the road, pedestrians, cyclists, and automobiles. But I foresee a day when this will apply to taxes, when the knowledge of how to get around taxes, when the knowledge of how to do your own taxes so creatively that you pay the least amount will be shared freely on the internet, so that anyone who wants to know what now only high-paid accountants and tax lawyers know, this creates a crisis of confidence, a crisis of legitimacy, where if people don't believe in government, they will actually have the option to opt out. Now, of course, the greatest consequence of that is the greater good. And the remedy to that is open government. Creating a way for more people to get involved, for more people to see government as relevant to their life, to actually acknowledge that in some way taxes are good because they allow us to have roads, they allow us to have water, they allow us to have all the things that allow us to have the city we have. Now, here in Toronto, we're in a bit of a stepchild relationship with the technology world as a whole. That we are an incredible center of excellence, but yet we're overshadowed by Kitchener-Waterloo. We're even overshadowed by the tech sector in Ottawa, largely because in both those centers, they don't really have other industries to compete with. So it allows those tech industries to shine in a way that Toronto's does not. But the reality is that we are above and beyond one of the best centers in the world partly because of the legacy of Marshall McLuhan, who turns 100 this year, and the city, to give it credit, is doing quite a lot to celebrate that. But open government can give us that second step, can empower the tech community in this city, can empower the civic community in this city to demonstrate the ways in which technology can be used, not just for the greater good, but along broader social engagement. And I'll give you an example of how this is going to have a tremendous effect in the next 2 or 3 years. And that has to do with the explosion of mobile technology. And by mobile technology, I don't mean BlackBerries. I don't mean smartphones in terms of the ability to Twitter or Facebook from wherever you are, but location-based services. So that you can actually, if for example, you walk into Dufferin Grove Park, receive an automatic notification that Parks and Rec is going to be holding a town hall in a couple of nights, and it will affect you as someone who likes to use Dufferin Grove on a regular basis. Further, this type of location-based services will allow people to tell when their garbage pickup is coming around the corner. Will allow them to tell when road construction is going to affect their street instantly. And this does not have to be provided by the city government. In fact, this will happen spontaneously by companies like Google, companies like Twitter, and companies like Facebook, in which many city staff, many city councillors may be entirely oblivious of this activity. So the role of open government is actually one of education. One of educating city staff, one of educating city councillors, one of shifting the bureaucratic culture so that the city as a whole is prepared for the incredible change that has already started and will continue to accelerate. And in closing, what I implore upon you to do is think critically and think for yourselves. If you look at the words of Google, if you look at the words of Facebook, they are talking about a revolution. If you look in the government, if you look, in the dictionary at the definition of revolution, it is the overthrow of government. As someone who's been studying this for 2 years, I can assure you that it is not a metaphor. It is not anything but explicit. The idea being that government will not be necessary because technology will deliver everything that we need. The reality is that's just not true. And in order for that to be refuted, we need leadership from the city government, and that leadership is in the form of openness. Very simply, very matter-of-factly, of embracing openness as a concept, as a way of managing information overload, of a way of getting help from Toronto citizens who are more than willing to help, who will do so on a volunteer basis, who will do so out of their own pocket. Why? Because of the shared experience of living in a city and the romanticism that is Toronto. The fact that in spite of us never having, at least in my lifetime, a hockey team that could even make the playoffs with any decent measure, we love this city and we even love our hockey team. The question is, do we love our city government? And I think the answer is yes. The question is, we haven't had an opportunity to get to know it. We haven't had an opportunity to court, to flirt, to engage in an extended relationship that's not based on dispute, that's not based on complaint, that's not based on when we have something go wrong, which is most often when people engage in city government, and is exactly how social media will be used if you do not create opportunities for people to get engaged constructively. The one true law of the internet is that it's easier to destroy than it is to construct. It's easier to take people down, to insult people, to bully people, than it is to stand for something. And that is why we need our legitimate public leadership to stand up and say, the internet is for Toronto, the internet is for everyone in Toronto, and we embrace the transparency and openness to not only show our relevance, but to show our cooperation with all citizens to make this the city that we believe it should be, but that the world still needs to recognize. Thank you very much.